So welcome in everyone today to the Psych Talk. Today we're going to change topics a little bit to talk about schemas. I'll go through what schemas are. We'll talk about particularly schemas in the context of how they affect our relationships. Because a lot of these maybe not so adaptive or negative schemas that we pick up and that are formed during our early years end up having a pretty big impact on our relationships with people and our way of life, basically, into adulthood. So the purpose of talking about schemas is really to pick up on something that maybe not a lot of people are aware of, or maybe people are aware that they have deep-seated beliefs about other people, about their environment, that is sort of having an impact on how they view others, how they treat others, how they react to things, particularly in relationships. It doesn't have to be romantic relationships. So relationships with friends, with partners, with their parents, that sort of thing. So schemas, and particularly the focus will be on sort of maladaptive or negative schemas, because the positive ones, well, they're great. Keep on maintaining those, I guess. But negative ones, as I said, can have a really big impact on people's ability to hold relationships, ability to commit to relationships. And colloquially, sometimes it's talked about in terms of baggage, for instance, that we bring into relationships. And even, professional relationships can be affected by schemas that we develop early in life. And as always, these talks are designed to provide education and information. So, this is really to help with acknowledging schemas that might apply to you and understanding how they work and how they might affect you. These talks are certainly not designed for diagnosis, and they're not designed for treatment. So if you, say, do identify with some parts of the talk, if you are experiencing distress, or if you are concerned or want more information, please see a health professional in your local area. So, what are schemas? Well, the development of schemas and schema therapy is often attributed to Jeffrey Young, an American psychologist. And what they are is beliefs about ourselves, beliefs about others, and beliefs about the environments in which we live and operate. Usually schemas are quite deep-seated beliefs, quite stable, quite ingrained beliefs, quite foundational, because they're often built in our childhood and early adolescence. And schemas are often quite unconditional as well. So, as an example, rather than saying, if I put too much into a relationship, it will be more painful when it ends. Schemas are more like, people will leave no matter what I do. Right? It's quite unconditional, quite stable, quite broad, quite deep-seated and ingrained. And they're often very difficult to shift because they've been built over a number of formative years for us. Often they've been built, and this is not an attempt to attribute blame or anything, but often they've been built through interactions with people very important and close to us, so parents, relatives, siblings, teachers, that sort of thing. And they've been built over usually a significant period of time, so it's not sort of one or two instances of, let's say, deep-seated trauma, although it can be that form schemas. Often it's those little interactions. Maybe one or both parents are not very in tune with the child's emotions, and that over the course of their entire childhood, that is a recurring theme. Well, that may create the basis for the formation of a maladaptive schema around emotions. The other thing about schemas is they tend to be very self-perpetuating. So we reinforce the schemas that we have. We tend to act in ways and react in ways in situations that often make our schemas stronger, that confirm our schemas and maintain them into adulthood and beyond. Often schemas will have sort of there'll be reasons why we do that, avoiding pain or whatever it might be. And a classic sort of colloquial example is, if we read in novels and that sort of thing, or in fiction, the person who sort of finds themselves always going out with the wrong person, right? They always choose a type of relationship that isn't, from an objective outside perspective, maybe isn't suitable for them or isn't good for them, right? But then that relationship ends, and then they keep finding a very similar sort of model of person to go out with. And you can find that sort of example in popular media. And that's a sort of example of the ability for schemas to really self-perpetuate, often subconsciously, in influencing our decisions and our behavior. And finally, they're usually formed when some kind of need is consistently not met throughout childhood and early adolescence. So as I said before, if a child's emotional needs weren't met by maybe their parents and also perhaps relatives and teachers throughout their childhood and adolescence, then that may form, say, an emotion deprivation schema in later adolescence and then through into adulthood, which has effects on their ability to recognize their own emotional needs, but also meet the emotional needs of others in relationship. So how do schemas work? I won't go too deep into this. There's sort of two primary mechanisms for schemas. One is schema perpetuation, the other one is healing. I'm going to talk about perpetuation because that's more about understanding how schemas operate on a day-to-day basis. Schema healing is more for treatment and therapy, and so if anybody is interested, please talk to a professional about that, health professional or a mental health professional. Schema perpetuation. So there's a few ways that schemas sort of are maintained in our daily lives and our behaviors. The first is cognitive distortions, so unhelpful thinking styles, basically. Experiences that we've had in the past, particularly negative experiences, lead us to think in ways such as people aren't trustworthy. or people will always abandon me in the end, right? And then we take these thinking habits and apply them in unhelpful ways to our life. I've done a series on unhelpful thinking styles already, and if anyone is interested, you can watch those either in the Twitch highlights or on YouTube. The other way that schemas perpetuate, and these are more relevant for this talk, is in schema coping styles. So, the three main coping styles, again, these are, I'm just going to go over them briefly, but the three main schema coping styles, when we come into situations that activate our schemas, schema surrender, avoidance, and overcompensation. And I'll give some examples a little bit later. But essentially, schema surrender means passively accepting and giving in to the schema. Again, as I said, schemas are generally unconditional, so when we surrender to a schema, we have unconditional acceptance of it, and we behave in ways that confirm or maintain or perpetuate the schema. Whatever negative belief it is we have about people, about ourselves, or about the environment, we behave in ways that confirm, perpetuate, and accept it. That's schema surrender. Schema avoidance, on the other hand, is a little bit self-explanatory. It's basically avoiding any sort of behavior, people, environments that may activate our schemas. This could be cognitive avoidance, so distractions, escapism through, let's say, gaming or binge watching TV, trying to forget difficult things that have happened in the past. Emotional avoidance, so things like numbing, minimizing, making things feel like it's not a big deal. And behavioral avoidance, so simply physically avoiding a situation that may trigger one of our schemas. And overcompensation is behaving in ways that seem opposite to what our schemas are demanding we do, in order to avoid, again, triggering the schema for as long as possible, or in order to meet the needs that aren't being met, but generally in an unhelpful way. What do I mean by all that? Alright, I'm going to give a couple of examples, and I'll go through them in a decent amount of depth, but I will talk about the actual 18 different types of schemas that were identified by Jeffrey Young and his colleagues in their research in future talks to this one. So in the next series of talks, I'll be going through each of the relevant schemas. That's why I haven't sort of named them at the moment. But as an example, okay, let's say we're talking about an abandonment or instability schema, right? So what this might involve is chronic anxiety about losing somebody's loved ones, exaggerated expectations that somebody's loved ones will leave them, and that's not just sort of leaving them for someone better in a relationship. That's also maybe due to somebody having lost a parent or a very close sibling or cousin when they were younger, and not really processing that, not really understanding what happened. So exaggerated expectations that their loved ones will abandon or leave them. Usually people with an abandonment schema have a hard time tolerating being alone. They have significantly increased emotional responses, almost always unhelpful emotional responses, to people leaving or a perception of somebody leaving, right? So again, sometimes in popular media you will see different reactions to grief when somebody dies, and for some people, maybe when someone really close to them dies, they will have fits of anger. Why have you abandoned me? Why have you left me? How dare you? That's a very distinct sort of or obvious sign of an abandonment schema, right? Or could be a very obvious sign. It doesn't always suggest that. Alternatively, someone could have very sad thoughts or potentially suicidal thoughts when their partner brings up small relationship problems, right? That's an exaggerated emotional response. Suddenly they think, oh, they're going to leave me, I'm going to be abandoned, and it triggers their schema around abandonment, usually again developed in younger formative years through experiences maybe of being, let's say their father died when they were quite young, and they didn't process that grief because the family didn't want to process it, or maybe they died in some sort of circumstance where the family found it shameful and didn't talk about it ever, and then their other parent was always late picking them up from school, or was never reliable to be there for them. All of these negative experiences add up to something that we would term an abandonment or instability schema. Right? So what does that look like in terms of schema coping styles that I talked about before? Let's say in terms of schema surrender, okay, people might choose relationships with people who cannot provide them with security, or people who have commitment problems, right? This is generally on purpose, but it doesn't mean it's conscious. It could be a subconscious choice that they make. And again, what this does is, when these people do abandon them, do leave them, it confirms their ideas about the world. It confirms their schema that people will abandon me. Right? That's an example of schema surrender. An example of schema overcompensation for somebody with an abandonment schema might be becoming overly clingy in a relationship, becoming overly suspicious, overly jealous. Okay, well, where were you, hiring private investigators, putting GPS trackers on their partners? Again, in popular media, we've seen these examples, and often people don't understand or acknowledge where these behaviors come from. Where they come from is schemas, very often. Having been abandoned when they were young, having gone through loss that they haven't processed, makes people behave in certain ways in future relationships. And that's where understanding your own schemas can be really important, and processing through them can be really important if we want fulfilling relationships, not just romantic ones, but with friends, with colleagues, with our parents, with our relatives. And schema avoidance in the context of abandonment could be, well, I don't want to be close to anybody because everybody will leave me eventually anyway. Right? So avoiding close relationships, whether that be close friends or close romantic relationships. However, for people who have abandonment schemas, usually they acknowledge, and deep down they do understand that they really crave connection with other people. They're usually deeply unhappy that they don't have someone to connect with, and deep down they want to seek that out. But again, the coping styles will change across different situations and across different moods, across different people that they interact with. So sometimes it will be surrender, sometimes it will be overcompensation, sometimes it will be avoidance. And just as a alternative example, again, there are 18 different types of schemas identified, and I'm going to go through them in future talks in a little bit more detail, and not all of them at once. But just as another quick example, let's say somebody has an emotion deprivation schema. What that often involves is that they ignore the emotional needs of themselves and they ignore the emotional needs of others. And that's typically because I don't want to stereotype too much here, but as an Asian myself, often, particularly with Asian parents, learning to acknowledge and cater to the emotional needs of children is not something that in a lot of cases comes very easily to Asian parents, particularly due to cultural reasons, due to education systems in a lot of Asian countries. So this is often seen in particular cultures that if parents consistently ignore the emotional needs of their children take it upon themselves when they become adults to ignore their own emotional needs and the emotional needs of others. As I said, schemas are quite self-perpetuating. What often happens as well in terms of beliefs is that beliefs are formed that emotional needs are not important, or that perhaps if I want to be a model, sort of strong, independent person, I shouldn't attend to, or I shouldn't have emotional needs. And that often leads to people feeling empty, feeling invisible, feeling like they don't matter. And something else that we might see in somebody with an emotional deprivation schema is that they may exhibit symptoms of depression, of sadness, of loneliness, often in private, but even sometimes in public, and they don't know how to ask for emotional nurturance and support. So again, when we talk about schema surrender, overcompensation, and avoidance, what might this look like in someone with emotion deprivation? Well, schema surrender might be that they repress their emotions, bottle them up, the colloquial term. They numb them. They could numb them through substances, for instance, but also cognitively. Just avoid any sort of thoughts attached to an emotional valence. Any sort of thought that might get them, that might trigger an emotion, basically to repress that, to suppress it, to not take it seriously. Or they could just deny the importance of their emotional needs. So again, they could exhibit symptoms of it. They could be crying themselves and berate themselves or criticize themselves to say, toughen up, why are you crying? Don't be an idiot or whatever. There's no issue, I don't care, I feel nothing. So, ignoring the emotional needs of their own self, as has happened to them probably in the past, in order to develop that schema. Unfortunately, they will often do this to other people as well when they are surrendering to their schema. So, in relationships, even if they do actually care about the other person, when the other person is showing a need for emotional nurturance, for instance, they'll stop themselves from doing that. Schema overcompensation for someone with emotion deprivation may be that at certain times they become overly demanding of attention, of affection, of nurturance, but because they don't know how to ask for it properly, which would be assertively or what we would say nicely, they'll often come across as aggressive or unreasonable. And in relationships, they may pick fights with their partner by accusing them, for instance, of not caring. But that's where schemas can become a huge problem and a source of friction, because in the one instance they may overcompensate and accuse their partner of not caring and be very aggressive about asking for their emotional needs to be met, and then in another situation they may surrender and not meet the emotional needs of their partner. And in terms of schema avoidance, well, it's actually similar to abandonment. People with emotion deprivation often avoid getting close to people. They deny that there's a problem. A little bit differently, though, to an abandonment schema. In an abandonment schema, people will often crave that attachment deep down to somebody, that connection. With emotion deprivation schemas, often people will deny that, they'll repress that need for connection, and they'll fail to sort of link the feelings of sadness and loneliness with their inability to connect with other people. Whereas, in abandonment, those two will be they'll be keenly aware that they need connection. It's just that they're too afraid of being abandoned to seek it out. So that's pretty much it for today. Again, just a reminder that this talk is intended to provide information and education only. It's not meant for diagnosis. It's certainly not meant for treatment. If you identify with any of this or are experiencing distressing symptoms and are concerned or want more information, please visit a health professional or mental health professional in your local area. So the next talk that we will do will be on some of the more prominent or maybe more common types of maladaptive schemas. We may be able to get through all of them, we may not, but abandonment, mistrust, abuse, emotion deprivation, defectiveness, shame, and social isolation are the ones that I'll try and get through in the next talk. And just a quick credit to the book Schema Therapy, A Practitioner's Guide by Jeffrey Young, where a lot of this information is sourced from. Thanks very much for listening, everyone, and see you in the next cycle.